Hey, deserving listeners, Love is Blind. Let's watch.
In a conservative household. But yeah, like I really didn't get into politics or like I didn't get interested until Trump took office and George Floyd.
I'm like kind of ignorant towards that stuff. Like I didn't vote in the last election. Like as long as I don't know, it's not gonna, do much. So
That is so annoying.
I'm sorry.
So I'm glad that if they value political viewpoints, they are talking about it, which is good. I imagine most of the cast members are concerned about this. I'm guessing there's a lot more conversations happening than we are seeing in the edit. There have been some already with some people. From my memory, most of the time people are agreeing with each other. And this one's interesting. Sarah, is saying that she is, I think, what people would call liberal or a Democrat. I don't know how she would describe it. And then he says, what did he say?
Took office and George Floyd.
I'm like kind of ignorant towards that stuff. Like I didn't vote in the last election. Like as long as I don't know, it's not gonna,
Of course, a lot of people took note of the George Floyd murder, and a lot of people were up in arms, but particularly Minneapolis, because that's where it happened. That's, from my memory, where the first major activist marches and protests occurred, where they marched on the police station and there was a fire. I might have some of this wrong, but I seem to remember that. In fact, at the time, I was, of course, in support of Black Lives Matter, had been since I had heard about it before George Floyd. I've been talking on this podcast for over a decade about the importance of training for police and for anti-racist measures, and to have policy regarding fairness of the treatment of individuals, and research and acknowledging the research that demonstrates that people of color, particularly Black people and Native Americans, are disproportionately mistreated by law enforcement at every level. So when George Floyd happened, it was just, to me, another story, because I had been following a lot of the stories. We did an episode on Philando Castile a while back, and I didn't think that it would amount to much because previous things had happened, and although there had been protests, it certainly wasn't on the level that George Floyd became. And I remember when the protests were happening in Minneapolis, I thought, wait, is this actually... Because I guess I'd become jaded or something because of all the times that I had engaged in activism. And, with George Floyd, I was as well in my way. But I wasn't hopeful for change because it wasn't changing much. I mean, there have been changes over the years, and there have been, you get old like me, and you do see cultural shifts, and things have improved on average, at least from my vantage point. It's hard to know. And we didn't really start researching this sort of thing until rather recently, and we still don't have all the data, because every municipality, every police officer, every law enforcement individual has a different track record and a different bias, right? So it's hard to know, but it does seem like things are better. We have a long way to go, of course. But when the major protests were happening in Minneapolis, I thought, oh, okay, so we're doing this now. Finally, people had been doing stuff for a long time, but this felt way more mainstream, I guess is the word. So she's saying that was a major event for her. I don't know if it would have been if she didn't live in Minneapolis, but I imagine for a lot of young people, a lot of people in Minneapolis, it was very important.
Office and George Floyd.
I'm like kind of ignorant towards that stuff. Like I didn't vote in the last election. Like as long as I don't know.
Okay, so he says he's ignorant on that stuff, and he says, for example, I didn't vote in the last election. And for them in their timeline, that would have been, I guess, maybe the 2020. There's elections all the time because it's not just the president. There's a lot of elections happening, and you have the midterms, you have your local elections, which are very important. Anyway, So he says he didn't vote in the last election. I'm guessing he's talking about the 2020. I don't know. And then he says, as long as I don't know, it's not gonna, do much. So that's an interesting phrase. If he said something like, if I paid attention to everything, I don't feel like I would have much power or sway on the overall picture, so I'm bowing out. Or I'm bowing out temporarily because I used to be really into it in the past and I got frustrated or something. I don't know. But this phrase, as long as I don't know, it's gonna, it's not gonna do much. So everyone, of course, Sarah included, has the prerogative and the responsibility to figure out how they're going to approach this in dating. And I can relate because in my circle, there's an almost complete uniformity in, I mean, not complete, but let's just put it this way. I hear about friends and other people who, when they go home for Thanksgiving or they hang out with their friends, that there are political discussions that are uncomfortable. I almost never experience that. Seattle is particular, and I guess my family is in agreement for a lot of things. Or if people disagree, they just don't bring it up. I don't tend to bring it up. People might think that if it's brought up at a family get-together or among friends, politics, for example, that I would have a lot to say. I'm a podcaster, I'm a professional yammerer. But when it comes to my personal life, I tend just not to say much, partially because if I get into it, I feel like I have to say the whole thing. I have a really hard time just summarizing or just getting out 1 out of 10 of my bullet points. It's like, I'll even tell people, they'll be like, they'll turn to me like, Kirk, what do you think? And I'll be like, well, if you want me to respond like in a way that feels satisfying to me, I'm going to have to get like a PowerPoint presentation out. And so you just don't even want, I can summarize by saying, I can relate to a lot of what you're saying, but you really just don't want to know my opinion. It'll pour the living daylights out of you. Some people will be like, go for it, Okay, well, let's start from the beginning. I don't necessarily have to experience this. Of course, I'm not dating, and my wife and I do see eye to eye. There's always like slight vibe maybe differences, certainly not in terms of voting or position on policy or anything like that. But anyway, so it's important for people. But I also want to put out there that it is completely okay for someone like Ben to, one, have the position that he has, and to not necessarily initiate or care that much about it in dating. I think that the requirement and the judgment of people when they present like Ben, if Sarah doesn't want to be with him, totally fine for that or whatever reason, right? But to require or judge or say there's something wrong with Ben, I think it just comes from my childhood and early adulthood where politics were very, very important to everybody, including me. But it wasn't something that you necessarily had long conversations about, particularly with people that you might disagree with. It was important to watch the news and pay attention to the politicians that you were voting for, the representatives, what they were voting on in their positions. But it wasn't necessarily required that you have those kind of conversations. Now, of course, I don't know how he identifies racially, but he looks white. I don't know if he is, but he looks white, and he's a man, and presumably he's at least, well, I don't know if he's heterosexual. I assume he is. I don't know. I assume he's cis. I don't know. But if he is white, cis, hetero, male, then he doesn't have to pay attention because he benefits from the system. He can not do anything and just coast on his privilege because the system will benefit him. So it is a part of privilege in general, but we can't, I believe, in my moral compass, say that Ben in particular is immoral or wrong or racist or acting like a privileged white male Protestant heterosexual guy because he is not doing it. I think, of course, we need to talk about privilege. Of course, we need to talk about the systems of power, and we need to advocate that everyone should probably pull their own weight regarding moving the ball forward and making sure that the system is safe and fair for everyone. And for the people that have the power and the privilege, they in particular should be mindful of that because they have the power to actually influence things, to spread things around, and everyone wins when there's fairness. So we, of course, say that, but I personally am not a fan of pointing a finger at a particular individual, particularly without knowing the full story. We don't know his background. Maybe he's in a transition zone. Maybe before he had the complete opposite of Sarah, and he's going through a phase where he just, he doesn't want that anymore. He rejects that, but he's not willing to go full to the other side of the aisle yet, and he doesn't really know. And he just doesn't like to talk about it because he doesn't want to get in fights because that's his experience. I think that's fine. Everyone has that right. Now, dating-wise, that's different, right? I'll tell you that if I were Sarah, I don't think I could date someone like Ben, purely based on what he just said. I don't know if that's right or wrong, but I'm telling you in terms of like spending all my time with someone and talking about lots of things, including news stories. I don't know if I could handle that. I don't know if things would work out for me. I don't know if I would be constantly annoyed or that we would be constant, or if we would eventually break up because of that. I don't know. I'm trying to think if I've ever been faced with a situation like that before, given that I live in Seattle. But anyway, so it's on several different levels. And if Sarah or if you, either way, maybe you wouldn't want to date Sarah because of her political position. Everyone can make their own choices about who they want to date, who they want to entertain the idea of getting engaged with, getting married. And I think it's important to allow people to have the freedom and the flexibility to have whatever view they want to have within limits, right? And to understand that personally, the way to sway and influence people to what I believe to be the moral, ethical, progressive, fair path is not through judgment. It is through love and listening and patience and leading by example.
It's not gonna, do much, so.
That is so annoying.
I'm sorry.
So
Yeah, and she's being honest, and I'm glad that she feels free to say how she feels. I was worried that she doesn't seem like that type. She's really demonstrating it now to stuff those feelings or to just accommodate, just to be like, oh, well, okay. Yeah, if she said that, that'd be fine. But if she has a strong stance on that, then I think people should be allowed to express that. And she has that. So I'm glad that she feels that she is able to stand on her own 2 feet in the face of this. Because I don't know if I showed it, but mainly he was hinting and not so hinting that he wanted to move forward with the process of getting engaged, the two of them. He said even the L word. And she was open to that. She was happy to hear that, but she wasn't really reciprocating that level of talk. So, I don't know where they are in the week, but given that they were heading down that road, and that's what prompted her to ask, it's like, okay, well, before we move forward, I want to talk about politics.
Oh, George Floyd. Mm-hmm. That obviously hit home because George Floyd happened in Minneapolis. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on Black Lives Matter?
Like, I'm not one way or another. I just kind of keep out of it.
I think it's very valuable.
Bren can have whatever with it. I don't. There's different ranges or different edges of the range, but for me personally, what he's saying, I could be friends or hang out maybe with him, but depending on everything else and all the other things that he was doing, and if I saw evidence that he was treating other people fairly and had a good heart and was open to hearing about privilege and oppression and whatnot, then I'm good. But the way he responded, it sounds like he is hiding something. Because it's hard to imagine someone having... Now, if he follows this up by saying, look, I have to tell you something, I was obsessed and I've lived in a household where it was constantly fighting all the time. And a long time ago, I just said, I don't want to get into it. I just want to work locally. At my workplace, I want to fair and I want to fight for justice in my relationships or in my friend group or something. I do not want to, I just can't. It's too hard for me. And so that's why I am just, I don't know anything about it. I've heard, and I don't look at Twitter for this reason. I don't look at Facebook. So I've heard a bit about Black Lives Matter, and I just have to tell you, I'm just kind of ignorant on it. So I'm open to talking about it, and maybe there's a chance that we align. But I've been trying to avoid for a understandable reason. Okay, but for him to say, yeah, I just don't really think about it, and if he followed up with, I don't have a phone, I don't have apps.
Racist. But I personally believe what happened to George Floyd and everything else that happened, I don't think that's right at all.
Yeah.
What's so important is to speak up for things that are happening around us, right? Our voice really does matter.
Yeah. I've just kind of been staying out of it.
I don't like those answers,
Okay.
to be honest.
Yeah. And I'm really glad that if that is her position, which a lot of people will have, that she is inquiring and she's not beating around the bush. She's being honest, and she's allowing herself to have that position and that reaction. That's great. Yeah. And the way he's responding, unless he has an explanation, unless he says, I don't even have a smartphone, or I have a past with a lot of trauma and history and conflict around politics, so I know I'm weird, but I really do try to avoid it. Or I have a hard time having these kind of conversations. I apologize. Something. But just to be like, yeah, I don't know. I'm not in it. It's like he's responding to if you were to ask me what I think about, I don't know, Kenny Chesney or something. That's a singer, right? That's a country. I don't listen to country, no offense, but it's just not a thing. There's a lot of music I don't listen to, screamo and other kind of super annoying like yell metal. But if you asked me about that, I'd be like, yeah, I don't really have an opinion about it. But this, it seems like he's avoiding. And if I got the full story, maybe I would understand. Well, what am I evaluating this on? If he's deceiving, that's not okay. And it's possible that he is lying by omission. When it comes to this, is that because there are times when but not in a situation like this. This requires disclosure. Yeah, I was thinking like if I was on the bus, for example, and just having a chat with some rando, and they point blank asked me about politics, and I didn't really understand the landscape, I might just say, well, I don't know. There's a lot of points of view, and I would just avoid it. But this is completely different. So if he's deceiving, then that's not okay. If he is just some sort of strange individual who doesn't follow politics for whatever reason, or the news, then okay, yeah, that's all right. I think he should say that. He would know that was different about him. If he has the complete opposite point of view of her, but is willing to change because he's not super committed to his point of view, okay. If he is wanting to change because he doesn't have a backbone, or he doesn't believe he deserves to have a point of view, then that's bad for him. Where's this headed? Is she gonna break? It sounded like she wasn't that into him anyway, honestly. So if they break up over this, maybe it's not too much of a loss for her. It will be for him. He said love. He said he loved her.
But it's okay, and I'm glad you're honest.
Yes.
I don't want you to lie, but I think it is so easy for us to not have an opinion.
Do you know if you would be able to marry someone?
Yeah, I think she might be talking about privilege, about white privilege. I don't know if that sounds like that's what she's saying. Like
they're not right next to you, fully believing everything that you do at this point?
I love to learn about other viewpoints as long as there's like a discussion. But I will tell you, basic human rights, equality. I need someone to be on the same page with me about that. I feel like that speaks volumes.
I'm really glad that she is talking about the fundamental and the foundation, because there's a good possibility, I don't know, that even if Ben is obscuring a lot of aspects of his viewpoint politically, you know, just as a for instance, let's say that he is this huge Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson, maybe a little bit of Andrew Tate on the side kind of guy, and he also is a good person, which is, you know, those things can happen. And he is a good person and he feels at home in those circles. They are speaking to things that he is worried about judgment from the outside or whatever. But if that were true in this hypothetical situation, there is a strong chance that if you just put the political markers aside or the signs of partisanry aside, and you were to say, do you believe in X, Y, and Z human rights as it manifests in the, people being treated fairly for their sexual orientation or for their gender identity or for their race or for their education level or their various different aspects of oppression. Do you fundamentally believe that everyone should be treated fairly? There's a chance that he would say yes to that, right? And then when you start to talk about specifics, then there is some debate there, right? And if you can come back to the foundation, then it can be easier to have a conversation with someone that is at least not in your political camp. You know, they might be on the other side of the aisle. And I think that's really important, not only just in this situation, but in all situations, because the way that people talk about other people politically, in my country anyway, is that they will accuse the other side of not having those fundamental human morals, those fundamental human ethics and positions, even though research shows that they do. And the influence from the outside will result in individuals applying that morality in very different ways, right? So I'm glad that she's bringing it to that, because maybe that's a segue into having a conversation about something that is not associated with political party or with partisanship, but is something that they can bond around and say, oh, well, I guess, if we put aside like whether or not you march for George Floyd and BLM, we do share a lot of values. And that's research shows that's very important, that people in long-term relationships are much more likely to be satisfied and last if they share values. And political values are part of that. Or the values that inform how you vote is maybe a way of putting it. So you can share the same values but vote somewhat different. And I know that's somewhat sacrilegious to say today, regardless of what side of the aisle you're on, but I do believe that to be true from research and from experience.
Who you are as a person and morals and values and, how you think of others.
Yeah, and I do think my beliefs lie more towards like what you're saying and how you believe, because it makes sense to me. And I
think the best way to look into how I do that is through my actions.
I just don't really know how to intelligently talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, so they seem to have established some eye to eye there. She's still grimacing a little bit. Food for thought.
Teaching people like fundamental values, I can't teach that.
I just got a girlfriend?
Okay. So Sarah in the one-on-one says, teaching someone fundamental values, I can't teach that. I don't know exactly what she's referring to, but I think by context, I could guess what she's referring to there. And then when the date is over, he goes back in the lounge. Now, we don't know what happened after that conversation. Maybe they had a lot of lovey-dovey stuff. And anyway, he goes back in the lounge. He says, I have a girlfriend, because he did ask about girlfriend-boyfriend status. But from my memory, did she say yes to that?
I don't know.
know. I thought you guys were sure.
So he didn't vote.
Oh, okay.
Then I'm like, okay, what do you think about Black Lives Matter?
Yeah.
And he said, honestly, like, I just like haven't
Yeah.
like educated myself on it. That's important to me.
Yeah.
So it's like,
Do you feel like he can like evolve in that?
It's a good conversation with a friend in the lounge. And I'm also encouraged that Sarah's recall of what he said is pretty spot on. That demonstrates differentiation and emotional regulation and wisdom, because we've seen that before, that the individual will leave the pods, come into the lounge and tell the story that just happened in the pods. And we know that that's not what happened. They are either purposely exaggerating or they heard it differently and are encoding the memories differently. It's important to understand that if someone is telling a story that you know or you suspect isn't true, something that you said, or, the classic is you have a couple, they get in a fight. The next day they talk about, well, last night we got in a fight and you said this. No, I didn't. You said, no, I didn't. And it often is interpreted as the other individual is purposely trying to gaslight you. And it might be, but it's probably not. It's that we are not recorders of reality. We're not a video camera. We're not a hard drive. We are a squishy bunch of goo between our ears that is not only perceiving things through a massive filter, but also encoding memories through a massive filter and then recalling that memory through a massive filter. So it's a good sign. It's a sign that she has the ability to see things more differentiated, mature, more healthy individuals, personality-wise, have a much easier time in a conflictual situation. They're able to have the conversation and assert themselves if needed without escalating and without judging, without being critical, which she wasn't in the clip. And they're also better at recalling it later on and not exaggerating. Because another person in her shoes would say, and then he said that, Black Lives Matter was stupid, or what, you know what I mean? And she almost said it exactly the way he said it.
I know,
Yeah.
maybe.
Yeah.
It's more of a thing that I would just like show you, like if we were dating, like you would be able to see in me. And I don't think she liked that answer.
Okay, well, at least Ben is living in reality, and because I was worried that he's like, yeah, that was a wonderful conversation. I have a girlfriend. Interesting. We've seen on this show, I guess, what people would call political conversations, right, between Ramses and Marissa and others. So is this a new trend? It makes me wonder if in previous seasons it wasn't talked about as much, or they just didn't include it in the edit. Sometimes I think that reality TV show editors will edit stuff like that out. Like one of the things that I notice on 90 Day Fiancé is religion is almost never brought up, even though religion is, for most people, a very central part of their lives, right? And I noticed that contrast when I watched Married at First Sight, and those showrunners, which is the same, Kinetic, I think does Love Is Blind and Married at First Sight, but anyway, different styles of editing. But in Married at First Sight, if someone was religious, they just left that all in, which I was like, oh, yeah, what? How come in 90 Day Fiancé there's no talk about religion? For some people, so I think we're seeing an increase in that. Either the editors are just allowing that to enter into, because sometimes I wonder if they don't include it because they don't want to alienate the audience to the cast member. Like if people liked Sarah, because I'm guessing that they did, because she hasn't done anything that I think would irk anybody yet, that if she were to have in her edit her political view, well, the audience would bifurcate. A certain group of people would like her, and then half would not, or whatever. I don't know the demographics of people who watch the show. But the editors don't want that to happen, because I think one of the principles, I don't know this necessarily, that in order to hook people, you have to have a combination of affinities for cast members. You have to have a cast member that you like. You have to have a cast member that you hate. You have to have a cast member that you don't know about. You have to have a cast member that reminds you of your ex-boyfriend. You have to have a cast member that reminds you of you. I think having that variety, and so you don't want to lose that role. All right, well, let's adjourn there. Everyone out there, please take care of yourself, truly, because you deserve it. You really, really do.